1942 became the moment when the United States of America ceased to be a distant observer of a global catastrophe and turned into one of its principal participants. Formally, America entered the war in December 1941 after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Yet it was 1942 that marked the first full year in which the American state, economy, military, and society fully realized this was not a war for months, nor for a single continent. It was a struggle for a new world order. Before that moment, the war looked different. Europe had been burning for years. Germany controlled most of the continent. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival, and Britain was holding on by its last strength. America was helping, with weapons, money, and resources, but remained across the ocean. In 1942, that distance disappeared. Washington understood a simple and brutal truth. If the United States did not assume an active role, the post-war world would be shaped by others, and likely by hostile forces. That is why U.S. strategy from the very beginning was not defensive, but global. America was not merely trying to repel Japan or help Britain survive. It entered the war with the intention of winning it completely. In 1942, a key strategic decision was made, the principle of Germany first. Despite the fact that Japan had directly attacked the United States, American leadership recognized the Third Reich as the primary threat to global stability. This meant that resources, production, and military planning would be focused above all on the defeat of Germany, even if the war in the Pacific demanded immediate sacrifices. For American society, 1942 became a year of shock and mobilization. Millions of men were drafted into the armed forces. Cities filled with military factories, training camps, and hospitals. What had been a peaceful nation only yesterday transformed within months into a country at war. Newspapers, radio, and cinema all worked toward a single goal: to explain to the people that this war was their personal responsibility. America entered the war not gradually, but abruptly and irreversibly. By 1942, the United States could no longer withdraw, negotiate, or grow tired. It assumed responsibility for the fate of its allies and for the final outcome of the war. This was a psychological turning point not only for Americans, but for the entire world. For Britain, the arrival of the United States meant the end of isolation. For the Soviet Union, it meant hope that the war would not remain a purely Eastern European slaughter. For the Axis powers, it meant the realization that they were no longer fighting merely armies, but an industrial, human, and technological giant. It was in 1942 that it became clear the war had ceased to be a series of campaigns and had become a global confrontation of resources, logistics, and endurance. And in this war, America entered not just as another state, but as a force capable of changing its very logic. This was not simply an entry into combat. It was the assumption of a role that would henceforth define the course of the 20th century.
In 1942, the United States did something no other country in human history had ever done. It transformed its entire economy into a single, continuous war machine. This was not just a shift to wartime production, it was a complete overhaul of the way of life, thinking, and work of tens of millions of people. Just yesterday, America had been living in peacetime and was only beginning to recover from the Great Depression. Yet by 1942, factories that once produced cars, refrigerators, and household appliances were now churning out tanks, airplanes, artillery, and ammunition. The assembly lines never stopped, day or night. For the first time in history, war became a matter of industrial scale, not just armies on the battlefield. The American government took strict control over production. Special wartime agencies were created to decide what and in what quantities to manufacture, where to send resources, and how quickly supplies had to reach the front. Businesses, labor unions, and the government worked as a single unit. Profits were no longer the main goal. Speed and mass production became the priority. In 1942, the U.S. began producing more aircraft than all the Axis powers combined. Tanks rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. Shipyards launched vessels so quickly that sometimes a new ship hit the water before German submarines could sink the previous one. The war became, for the first time, a race of production pace. Standardization became especially important. American equipment was not always perfect, but it was simple, repairable, and mass-producible. Tanks, planes, and trucks were designed to be quickly learned, easily maintained, and delivered anywhere in the world. This was a fundamentally new vision of war, not as a series of heroic battles, but as a logistical system. At the same time, American society was changing. Millions of women entered factories to replace men who had gone to the front. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a symbol of the new America, a nation where everyone worked for victory. War penetrated daily life. Consumption standards, rationing, and saving fuel and metal became part of everyday routines. It was in 1942 that the concept that would later define America's role in the world was born, the arsenal of democracy. The U.S. produced weapons not only for itself, but supplied them to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies. In effect, America was already fighting before its soldiers engaged in combat, fighting through factories, shipyards, and supply depots. To the Axis powers, this became a deadly verdict, though they did not realize it immediately. Germany and Japan could win battles, but they could not compete with an economy that grew in production every month without limits. War was no longer a question of generals' talent. It had become a question of endurance. By 1942, it was clear, even if the fronts still wavered, even if victory seemed distant, the outcome of the war was already being decided, not only in the trenches, but in the factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and California. America had created the material foundation for the eventual defeat of the Axis. And from that moment on, the war was irreversible.
In 1942, the war for the United States was not fought only on the fronts or across the oceans. It moved through ports, railways, warehouses, and convoys of ships that continuously crossed the continents. It was in this year that the Lend-Lease program transformed from a political tool into an essential system for the survival of the Allies. Formally, Lend-Lease existed before, but 1942 marked the moment when its scale reached a level without which the war could not continue. America assumed the role of supplying not only weapons, but everything that made an army operational: vehicles, fuel, food, spare parts, and communication equipment. This was a war where the decisive factor was not how many soldiers stood in formation, but whether they could move, eat, and fight without interruption. For the Soviet Union, 1942 was critical.
The Wehrmacht was pushing south toward the Caucasus and the Volga. The front was cracking. Industrial production had been partially evacuated, and the transportation system was barely keeping up. It was here that American aid became a factor often overlooked in battlefield reports, but of immense significance. Thousands of trucks sent under Lend-Lease gave the Red Army mobility. Without them, it would have been impossible to quickly redeploy troops, ammunition, and fuel across the vast expanse of the front. Americans supplied not only equipment, but also food. Canned goods, grain, powdered milk, meat, these seemed secondary, but in reality they determined the combat effectiveness of soldiers. In 1942, the war had become so exhausting that hunger and lack of resources could break an army faster than enemy tanks. Lend-Lease allowed the Allies to focus on fighting without being distracted by the struggle for basic survival. For Great Britain, American supplies were a matter of strategic stability. The country lived under constant threat of a naval blockade, with German submarines trying to strangle its economy. Ships, aircraft, radar, and ammunition from the United States maintained Britain's ability to control the seas and the skies. Without this support, Britain might have faced a situation in which continuing the war became impossible. Lend-Lease was also a demonstration of a new kind of warfare, the war of logistics. American engineers and planners thought not in terms of fronts, but in flows. How many tons of cargo needed to be delivered, by which routes, at what speed? Through the Arctic, Iran, and the Pacific. Every route was dangerous, every convoy a target for the enemy, yet the flow never stopped. This system gradually disrupted the Axis powers' strategy. Germany and Japan could destroy individual convoys, but they could not stop the sheer volume. Every sunken ship was replaced by two more. Every loss was offset by production. The war entered a new mode, where defeat became a matter of time. In 1942, Lend-Lease finally shattered the illusion that Germany could defeat the Soviet Union through exhaustion, or that Japan could force Britain and China to surrender. America created a rear that was practically inexhaustible. And although American soldiers were not yet fighting on all fronts, the United States was already at full strength, through crates of ammunition, columns of trucks, and endless supply routes. It was a silent war, but without it, the loud battles simply wouldn't have happened.
At the beginning of 1942, the Japanese Empire seemed almost invincible. In just a few months, it had conquered vast territories, crushed British and American garrisons, controlled key sea routes, and dictated terms across much of the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, the United States was in shock, while the Japanese command was confident it had time to consolidate its gains and force America to accept a compromise peace. But 1942 would shatter that logic. American strategy in the Pacific was not based on quick revenge, but on cold calculation. The U.S. understood that Japan could not be defeated with a single strike. It could only be gradually deprived of initiative, forced to fight a war of attrition, and stripped of its ability to rebuild its navy and air force. The first step toward this turning point came in June 1942. The Battle of Midway became a moment that the Japanese themselves would later call the beginning of the end. Thanks to intelligence and the interception of Japanese codes, the U.S. knew where and when the enemy would strike. When the Japanese carriers approached Midway, they expected an easy victory. Instead, they walked into a trap. Within a few hours, Japan lost the core of its striking fleet, its carriers and experienced air crews, which could not be quickly replaced. This was not just a defeat, it was a loss of strategic advantage. For the first time since the war, Japan could no longer dictate the terms. It was forced to react. But the full significance of 1942 became even clearer later at Guadalcanal. There, America moved from defense to offense for the first time. It was a grueling, bloody, and exhausting campaign, far from triumphant marches. American troops lacked sufficient experience, often made mistakes, and lost men and equipment. Yet they learned, and did so faster than Japan could adapt. Guadalcanal revealed a fundamental difference between the two nations. Japan fought with limited resources, relying on quality and self-sacrifice. The U.S. fought with mass, logistics, and the ability to continuously supply reinforcements. Every Japanese loss was painful and almost irreparable. Every American loss was offset by new ships, planes, and soldiers. It became clear in 1942 that Japan could not win a war of attrition. It had lost the ability to conduct an offensive strategy and was doomed to defend an ever-expanding territory. The war in the Pacific ceased to be a lightning-fast expansion and turned into a slow, relentless retreat. For America, these battles became a school of war. In 1942, the U.S. was not yet a perfectly efficient military machine, but it was learning on the fly, correcting mistakes, and gaining experience. Every battle, every island made the Army stronger and the Navy more dangerous. The psychological effect was no less important. Midway and Guadalcanal proved to the American public that Japan could be defeated. They shattered the myth of its invincibility. The war was no longer a continuous retreat and fear. It now offered hope. The year 1942 in the Pacific did not bring an immediate victory, but it set the course for the war's future. Slowly, at great cost, yet with Japan no longer able to change the outcome. By the fall of 1942, the war between the United States and Germany existed more on paper and in strategic plans than on the battlefield. American soldiers were already dying in the Pacific. Factories were running at full capacity, and Lend-Lease supplies were flowing in abundance, but there had been no direct land confrontation with the Wehrmacht. North Africa became the place where America first met the German army face to face. Operation Torch was more than just a military action. It was a political and strategic compromise between the Allies. The United States was not yet ready for a direct invasion of Western Europe, and Britain did not want to risk a catastrophe reminiscent of the First World War. North Africa appeared to be the ideal stepping stone, remote, difficult, but manageable. In November 1942, American and British forces landed on the coasts of Morocco and Algeria. For the United States, this was the first large-scale amphibious operation in its history. Everything was new. Coordinating the Navy and Air Force, landing under fire, supplying troops across the ocean, managing tens of thousands of soldiers in combat conditions. Mistakes were inevitable and costly. The first encounters with German troops revealed an uncomfortable truth. The American army was inexperienced. The soldiers were brave and there was plenty of equipment, but command often faltered, communications broke down, and coordination between units was weak. This became evident during the early setbacks when German forces, hardened by war, were able to impose their rules on the Americans. But that was precisely the value of Africa. It became a proving ground where the United States quickly learned how to fight modern war. Commanders were replaced, tactics were revised, and coordination between branches improved. What appeared as weakness in 1942 transformed into experience within a few months. For Germany, the arrival of American forces in North Africa was a serious problem. The Wehrmacht was forced to divert troops, equipment, and fuel, resources desperately needed on the Eastern Front. Every tank and plane sent to Africa could not be used at Stalingrad or in the Caucasus. North Africa opened the way for the Allies into the Mediterranean. It created a threat to southern Europe and Italy, forcing Hitler to fight on yet another front. The war was no longer linear. Germany could no longer concentrate its forces in one place. The fronts multiplied, and resources were stretched thin. For the American public, these battles had special significance. This was the first war in which American soldiers fought the Nazi army on land. The first casualties, the first heroes, the first funeral letters from Europe, all became real. The war ceased to be an abstraction. 1942 in North Africa did not bring an immediate victory, but it achieved the most important thing. The United States was no longer a novice. America entered the war against Germany not theoretically, but in reality, with blood, mistakes, and experience. And it was here that the path began, one that would eventually lead the Allies to Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and ultimately Berlin.
In 1942, the war rose to a new level in the skies. While the United States was still gaining combat experience on land and at sea, in the air, America immediately focused on scale and systematic operations. It was this year that the air campaign began, which would eventually become one of the main tools for destroying the Third Reich. American command believed in the idea of strategic bombing. The logic was simple, yet ruthless. If factories, transportation, energy systems, and command centers were destroyed, the enemy army would eventually lose its ability to fight. This was a war not against soldiers in the trenches, but against the very foundations of the state that sent them to the front. In 1942, the United States carried out daytime bombing raids over Europe for the first time. It was a deliberate decision. The British mostly flew at night, reducing losses but sacrificing accuracy. The Americans, however, relied on precision strikes and believed that well-armed bombers could penetrate through fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It was a bold and risky concept. The first raids showed that reality was far harsher than theory. German air defenses and fighter planes inflicted heavy losses. Crews flew under constant fear, often without adequate escort. Every mission was a trial, and not all returned. Yet, despite these challenges, the campaign continued. It is important to understand that in 1942, strategic bombing had not yet crippled German industry. But it achieved something else. It forced Germany to alter the entire structure of the war.
The Third Reich had to divert aircraft from the front lines, build thousands of anti-aircraft guns, and reallocate resources to protect cities and factories. Every anti-aircraft shell meant one less shell available on the Eastern Front. The air war became a battle of nerves and endurance. German civilians felt for the first time that the front was no longer far away. Sirens, destruction, and fires gradually undermined the sense of security at home. The war slowly penetrated the everyday life of the Reich. For the United States, 1942 was a year of learning. The U.S. Army Air Forces suffered losses, but simultaneously improved tactics, communications, and coordination with the British. Experience was gained that would later enable devastating strikes on Germany in 1943-1944. Without the painful lessons of 1942, those victories would have been impossible. The air campaign also had a profound symbolic effect. America demonstrated that it could reach the enemy anywhere. Neither the Atlantic, fortifications, nor borders could provide protection. This was the beginning of a new era of warfare, where no state could hide behind the front line. In 1942, American bombers were not yet deciding the outcome of the war on their own. But it was then that the foundation of air pressure was laid, pressure that would eventually become unbearable for the German economy and morale. It was a slow, exhausting war in the sky, and it had only just begun. In 1942, something happened in World War II that was more important than individual battles or operations. The sense of the future changed. Until that moment, the war remained an open question. Germany and Japan could still dream of victory, while the Allies could only hope to survive. But in 1942, it became clear the war now had a direction, and that direction was not in favor of the Axis powers. The entry of the United States transformed the conflict into a contest of resources in which the outcome was almost predictable. America was not just fighting, it was building a system capable of sustaining the war for years without pause. For Germany and Japan, this was the worst possible scenario. Even the most successful campaigns no longer guaranteed strategic advantage. Every victory cost them resources that could no longer be replenished. The psychological impact was enormous. For the Allies, the arrival of the United States meant confidence that the war would not end in compromise or defeat. Britain was no longer on the brink of exhaustion. The Soviet Union received not only material support, but also strategic hope. It was no longer facing Germany alone. Even where the fronts were still under pressure, there was a sense of time. The Allies could wait and prepare. For the Axis powers, this year marked a moment of uneasy realization. Their resources were limited, their economies strained, and human losses irreversible. They were fighting a nation that could afford mistakes, defeats, and pauses to learn. This was a fundamental asymmetry, becoming more apparent with each passing month. 1942 also shaped the post-war world. It became clear that the United States would emerge from the war not just as a victor, but as a central force in global politics. America learned how to manage a coalition, allocate resources, and plan a war on a planetary scale. This experience made it the state it would become after 1945, a nation that sets the rules. It is also important that from this moment on, the war was no longer a short hope for a miracle. It became a long road toward an inevitable conclusion. Germany and Japan could still resist, inflict painful blows, and prolong the agony, but they could no longer change the outcome. This is why 1942 is often not remembered as a year of great victories. There was too much blood, defeat, and uncertainty. But from a historical perspective, it becomes clear it was the year when the war first became winnable for the Allies. Not because the enemy was defeated, but because it could no longer win. It was the year when the world, without even realizing it, took a step toward the final act of the greatest war in human history.